As we turn in Scripture today, we're going to open the book of Revelation. Now, I imagine some of you have heard of this book before, but show of hands, who has read it through? We have a few people. Good, good. And if you at home have, just type Revelation into the comments. It's just kind of interesting to connect those things up because there is a lot of content in this book that I bet you those of you who have not read it have heard of. It gets spoken of a lot, in a lot of different ways. It gets used in different ways by our modern culture. It has been used throughout many years as a basis for lots of fiction or lots of other work in philosophy. It has been used to try and predict the future. It has been used to prove that past predictions came true. There's a lot that has been done with the book of Revelation. So just before we jump in, because I think it's important to know a little bit about where this is coming from, I want to talk about this book just for a moment. First off, you notice that I am saying Revelation, not Revelations. And honestly, I think that I called it Revelations for almost my entire life until I went to seminary and somebody's like, did you bother to notice that there's no S on the end of that word? So this is, and the name of it does give it away, it is a revelation. It is a book, it is a letter written by a person who gets named as John. Now, we don't really know particularly what John. There's a good chance it's not the John from the book of John. There's a good chance it's not the John who walked with Jesus. So all we know is he's John of Patmos, meaning that was the place he lived. And he shares these dreamlike stories that were revealed to him, that were revelations to him. And he writes as being, these are revelations to him from Jesus. And they speak of some pretty fantastic and pretty wildly imaginative parts. And now we're going to read about a woman and a child and a dragon. And these are quite wildly imaginative, but it helps for us to know that what John was doing was addressing some things that the readers of his letter would have known. In fact, he's addressing things that we sort of know already. He's addressing that there is a balance, a battle between good and evil within the world and within the hearts of humans. And he recognizes in this that Jesus, as being a person who died and rose, has already done the work of overcoming death. These are important pieces as we read Revelation to sort of keep in the backs of our minds, because death comes up an awful lot in Revelation. Sometimes it's individuals dying, and sometimes it's whole armies dying. And as John is writing, some part of what he's saying is these are people who are stepping into putting off the old self, as we describe in Jesus' death and resurrection, in dying to our old selves, so that we can more comfortably step into the new Jerusalem, the new world, the new kingdom of God which is coming. This idea of the new Jerusalem, a city that is coming down to earth, this comes from Revelation as well. There are many pieces. The idea of Satan being cast out, the idea of armies, great angel armies fighting against armies of evil. These are all ideas that come from Revelation as well. And so I do invite you at some point to spend some time reading the book of Revelation. It's not an easy read, but it's one of those things where when you read it, you realize, oh, wait a minute, I've heard that before, or I know this reference. It actually reminds me a lot of the time that I watched Casablanca. Who has seen Casablanca as a movie? Thank goodness. I was going to be worried if I hadn't. But I didn't actually watch Casablanca until quite late in my life. Like, it wasn't something that I grew up with. And as I'm watching it, I realized that, like, every other movie made sense, refers to pieces of Casablanca. You know, like, here's looking at you, kid, and play it, Sam, play as time goes by. And I remember Paris. You wore blue, the Germans wore gray. Is that right? Something like that. All these quotes come from that same movie. So many quotes, so many ideas, so many pieces of our culture and stories that we read today come from Revelation. So we're going to read here a piece of Revelation 12, 1-6. A great portent or sign appeared in heaven: a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pangs in agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down a third of the stars from heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear her child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the darkness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. Anybody just get that right off the top? Did that make a whole pile of sense to you? Did you, as you were listening to that, were you thinking, oh yeah, okay, well I know what the 12 stars mean, and I know the sun and moon under her feet, I totally get what that means, and now we've got these heads and these horns and these diadems. Did that all make sense to you? I'm so glad it didn't. If you had said yes, I would have been quite worried, because I really didn't understand that at all. It took me quite a bit of digging and research to understand, and that's on top of the fact that this certainly isn't the first time that I've read the book of Revelation. In fact, I've even preached on this exact verse in the past. Quite a few years ago, I had the nerve to claim that there were dragons during Christmas. Of course, this is a little bit of the Advent story. It's a slightly different take on our Advent story, but if you read that on the 24th of December, there are riots. I'm just letting you know, in case you wondered. People get a little nervous if we step away from the manger and start talking about dragons eating babies. It's an uncomfortable thing. But to the people who heard this letter first, the people who, in the early churches, who heard these words, they knew exactly what the writer was doing. They knew exactly what those 12 stars meant. They knew exactly what the sun and the moon were about. They knew that the 7 heads and the 10 horns and the 7 diadems, they knew. And so I'm going to share some little pieces, because it kind of helps us a bit if we know a bit more. Now, I will preface this by saying that I have not spent my entire life being a biblical historical scholar. And those people who have understand this much better. So I'm definitely standing on the shoulders of giants as I share with you. But what this writer was doing is he was weaving together a collection of different stories of the Hebrew history. A collection of different ideas and stories that the early readers, the early Christians would have understood, especially those who came by being Christian by starting out as Jews. This connection, these stories are ancient, and they come from the Old Testament. In fact, the more of Revelation you read, the more that you realize it's really just repeating and recontextualizing a lot of pieces from the Old Testament. There's an awful lot of Daniel that gets repeated in Revelation. There's an awful lot of Ezekiel. It draws from the prophets. This book is really a rehash. It's sort of, okay, and there's a good reason it lands at the very end of our modern Bible. It takes all of this, all these pieces that come before it, and it sort of does a summary. And it kind of places it in a space where we can understand. Now, I even laugh when I say that, because the way it's written, it's hard for we English speakers who don't know all of the Hebrew history to even dig our teeth into it. The story of the dragon is a story that is ancient to them and is ancient to us. And it's something that when we let ourselves listen and let ourselves step into and open ourselves up to what might be going on in this story, we realize that that author is naming truths that we all already agree with. See, those 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems, they are referring to a collection of ancient empires. Empires who were certain to hold the Hebrew people under the heel of their boot. He didn't name them there, but even a little bit of time spent in the Old Testament, you can see that these things are referring to the Babylonians. We remember them as being kind of the bad guys sometimes. The Egyptians sneak in there. The Egyptians are definitely considered bad guys by the Hebrew people. The Persians, and now in this, a much more modern idea, the Romans. And we know the Romans were the empire to be resisted in Jesus' day as well. And so this dragon is written up as a sum total of empires. Empires that over time wind up becoming so huge that they are incapable of caring for people. Now, some empires are created that way. They're designed that way. The Roman Empire famously had the motto of peace through victory, which really translates to mean kill anybody who opposes you. But do it in a way that sounds good. Peace through victory. Because anybody who stands up against us dies. And that idea, that mindset, is one that we all know very clearly. We don't have to be children who studied history of Rome to know this. Each and every one of us have experienced in our lives an empire that was more interested in its own value than our value. The devil in this detail, the dragon that shows up, is that fight between good and evil, whether it be inside each one of us, or whether it be a broader conversation about evil that becomes systemic, evil that becomes the way empires run, evil that becomes part of our systems and our companies and our governmental organizations. It takes a step back and lays that all on a mythical creature that we're comfortable with tossing out of heaven. We're comfortable to see that the beast gets kicked out. Now, it's interesting. I'm not going to read the entire book, but there are so many other pieces that we get this idea coming back up. In fact, only a couple of chapters later, the dragon itself becomes two beasts. These two beasts come out of the dragon. And it's really interesting because they're even more specifically the military-industrial complex that empires create. And the other side is the financial and communications and piece that says the piece that actually goes and does the propaganda of peace through victory. As long as you don't disagree with us, then you'll be fine. It's really interesting because I didn't really think of ancient empires as being military-industrial complexes. I thought that's something that only we modern people had our fingers on. As I was doing this research, I also wanted to spend a little time with some dragons in our lives. And so I looked at, kind of like last week when we were looking at Shrek and the talking donkey, I thought, well, what are some movies today that have dragons? And there are many. And I settled on Smaug, who's a character in The Hobbit, not just because it's a movie that's familiar and people would know, but also because it's a book, which is a little bit older, and maybe some of you here have read some Tolkien. And also because Tolkien, the writer, did this amazing job of creating backstory that explained the story of Smaug. I don't know how many of you have either seen the movie or read the book or are Tolkien fans, but Smaug was a dragon whose chief goal was greed. Absolute greed. Couldn't be fussed about who he killed. Couldn't be fussed about what got in his way. He had power so far outside of any human power at the time that it was pretty easy. He just killed you if you got in his way. And he found that there is this mountain of gold residing in a mountain, and he wanted it. So he killed everybody who had it, whether they were humans or dwarves. It didn't really matter. He just wiped them all out. And then he lay on his mound of gold. Happy. That's what he wanted. He wanted to lie on his mound of gold. That's a pretty obvious and easy greed conversation. And it's easy for us to say, well, I mean, that seems like a complete waste of this mound of gold. Why would he just hoard it? Why wouldn't he do something with it? That's all he wanted. In fact, it gets even better because he had these scales that were very, very protective. They were like iron. You could shoot whatever you wanted at him and you couldn't kill him. And you can't get close enough because he breathes fire. And so he was pretty much impenetrable, except his belly was soft. And so over time, as he lay on his gold and on his diamonds, on his gems, on his jewels, over 170 years, he lay on them and they slowly became embedded in his tummy. So then he was even armored on the inside too. His diamond waistcoat, as it gets referred to, is the way that he protected himself. So his greed itself became the thing that was protecting him as well. It's interesting as we look into how Tolkien created this story. Some resources say that he drew from the ancient English or Germanic Beowulf. Some of you may have studied Beowulf when you were in university. It may, in fact, have come from some Norse mythology, but it's really interesting that he wrote a dragon that was the embodiment of evil, of greed. He wrote a dragon that didn't care at all who lived or who died. And over time, this dragon showed this greed by, in conversation, telling people, I really don't care. You can come and take it, I'll just kill you. And I'll just get more. This is mine. While I was looking into Smaug, I discovered a really entertaining thing. You've probably heard of Forbes. There are a list of people the Forbes list of people who have wealth. You've probably heard of these things. Forbes is always making lists. Well, one time they made a list of fictional characters who had wealth. And it's interesting to learn that Smaug is actually second on the list. Now, it's hard to come up with actual value for what humans own, and it's even harder to come up with actual value for what fictional characters own. But from the descriptions of how tall and how wide the pile of gold and gems was, they estimated the weight of gold at the current price of gold, and they said, Smaug has $62 billion in value. That's fairly a decent piece of coin. Just for interest, Scrooge McDuck. He's top. He's the number one. And they couldn't even put a number on him. So we've got Smaug, the second richest fictional character of all time. So this amazing brain who wrote a fictional character to describe ultimate greed comes up with $62 billion. You know what's terrifying? There are living humans who have more than that. There are systems in our world today that create a circumstance where humans can hoard more wealth than the most wildly fantastical embodiments of greed and evil that writers can come up with. How amazing to think that reality is even bigger than the art. How wild to think that our lives today, the culture, the societies that we belong to, create and allow for such hoarding, such greed. And what we notice is fictional writers write this as dragons so they can be slayed. Now, I don't want to at any point suggest that we need to take those few humans who have all the wealth and kill them and separate their wealth. Unfortunately, there are many people I've seen online in the last little while. Have you seen this phrase, eat the rich? I do not support this idea, but I do think that we live in a world that encourages this level of wealth. If you've read any self-help book about how to become successful, folks like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, these are people who will be named as being extremely successful at, hoarding, at collecting, at exemplifying greed. And yet those books sell. Yet those books fly off the shelves. The articles that describe how you too can have just as much money as Jeff Bezos, how you too can have the life you've always wanted. You can own 3 yachts. This is the society we live in. And yet we have writers from antiquity till now who have seen inside the human heart, who have seen inside our societies and said, don't you understand that greed is something to slay? The idea that we are capable of that level of greed at a corporate level. So I started today by asking, what does corporate sin mean to you? The word corporate gets used 2 different ways in this, and we can make it all about capitalism and companies that put profit before human life. That is definitely a thing, but the word corporate here, I'm meaning more all of us together. What does it look like when we sin as humanity? Because I really do think that Christianity has spoken for years and years and years about sin, but we have accidentally narrowed it down to say, oh, well, as long as I can deal with my sin, then that's what we need to sort out. And I'm not saying that's not necessary, but we've been tricked in a way to think about our own personal sin without thinking about the sin of us as humans. We've been tricked in a way to be so focused on our little piece that we're not paying attention to the bigger story. We've been tricked into not noticing that we've created dragons. And we've supported them. And we've added to their hoard. We are part of this problem, which also means we are solution. Now here's where it gets complicated. Because each of us is just us. I'm me, you're you, you're you, you're you. We are each just one individual. And we already know that with the steel-like scales and the diamond waistcoat protecting him, it's not possible for any one of us to slay the dragon of greed. It's far too big. It's not possible for any one of us to change this corporate, this societal, this cultural greed that we live in. Except in every one of the pieces of literature that I read about successful slaying of dragons, it was always a plucky band of misfits. And if you think about the great stories that you've read, whether they be fairy tales or some other work of fiction, it's always a few individuals. Very often not the ones you would expect. Very often not the ones who already had the skill set necessary. Very often people who really don't get along during the process. Of course, we learn in the end that it was the process that made them friends. These stories are so common. These are exactly how our artists write stories. We write epic poetry about it. We have songs about it. These are the stories. You know why those are the things that sell? You know why those are the ones that we keep reading? Because we also sense the truth within that too. So when we sit in a place of worry, of anguish, perhaps even depression and anxiety, saying, I know that greed is a problem, but I'm just little old me. It's little old me and little old you that will change. It has only ever been little old me's and you's that have made a difference. See, the wonderful irony that we read in these stories is one that sits deep within our hearts as well. These corporate ideas, this absolute overwhelming wealth, has become so focused on the big story and missing out on the individuals that they can't notice the tiny little individual who has found the chink in the armor, The one little spot on Smaug where an arrow can pierce. We all have the ability to slay the dragon of greed. I mean, we know it's out there. We don't have to read Revelation. We don't have to read Tolkien. We don't have to go any farther than looking in ourselves and looking at the things that draw us. And so start here and work there. Don't stop here. This is only a stepping stone. But also don't let the size of the problem ever stop you from trying. The one commonality of all these stories, whether it be the writer of Revelation who was drawing roots from the Egyptians and the Persians and the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Romans, whether it be a fictional writer who is describing a dragon, the one commonality is all empires end. The one commonality that Jesus spoke of so frequently is that all empires end. It's up to us to resist. It's up to us to do our little bit where we can. It's up to us to find that little plucky band of misfits to travel through this world together and just be better than the rest of all this garbage. See, in every one of these cases, in every one of these empires, it's the empire itself that has lost control and is now focused on just growing and just developing and just greed and hoarding. Almost never the individuals. So let's take back the control that is ours by changing us, by changing our little bit of the world. Let's slay some dragons. Amen.